Good evening. Really appreciate everybody being here. Appreciate the opportunity. Thankful for the invitation. My wife and I don't come up to Orlando as often as we used to, so we're glad for the opportunity. I-4 only turned into a parking lot twice on our way up here, so that's pretty good. That's better than usual, so we're glad for that. The topic I've been assigned is Ancient Message, Modern Application, David and Goliath. So I want to go ahead and invite you to turn your Bibles to 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel 17, where we read about this really famous account between David and Goliath. I remember, I think it was 2010, I could be wrong. I remember in the Super Bowl, the New York Giants were facing off against the New England Patriots. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the New England Patriots had won every game that year leading into that Super Bowl. And the New York Giants barely squeaked in by the skin of their teeth into the playoffs. And almost every NFL commentator was billing this football game as David versus Goliath. Of all the stories in the Bible, true accounts in the Bible, I don't know if there is one that has as much play in our modern culture as David and Goliath. Anytime there's a mismatch, anytime there's, maybe a boxer who has more wins, or there's a college football team with a bigger football budget, or whatever it is, whenever there's a mismatch in our culture, we call it a David versus Goliath battle. But we're going to look into a little bit more into this famous account here tonight and hopefully gain some application for our lives, not just for our day-to-day lives, things that will help us as we strive to live as Christians and live lives that are pleasing to God, but also some great spiritual application, because our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ sits on David's throne. He's known as the Son of David. And so when we look at David and see him act heroically, it should cause us to look at Jesus and see some parallels. So 1 Samuel 17, and we're going to start with just some context and some commentary. We're just going to walk through this story. And there are a lot of verses here. I'm not going to comment necessarily on every one. Just try to clear some things up as we go along and add some interesting things that we may or may not have been aware of to begin with. So 1 Samuel 17, and at this point, David has been anointed king by Samuel, but Saul is still the acting king. Saul hasn't come to the point of utter foolishness quite yet, to where God completely takes away his kingship and eventually his life. But we're going to start here in 1 Samuel 17, and we see the scene is set. 1 Samuel 17, verses 1 through 3, if you notice that with me. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Soko and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and a valley between them. Now, this might seem weird to us, but in that culture at that time, that's usually how these battles would begin. And if we've read our Old Testaments, we're familiar with this idea of, hey, me and my men are going to be on one side of this valley, you and your men are going to be on the other side of the valley, we'll meet in the middle, and we'll see what goes down. Oftentimes, like this, when it was almost seen as warring tribes, there was a religious component to these battles. And in many people's minds, especially the pagans' mind, whoever won the battle, it was their god who was really stronger or better. So this was more than just a chess match. This is more than just a battle. There was a religious component. So here's the scene. You've got Saul and his men. You've got the Philistines on one side, and they are going to meet in the valley and see who wins and see whose god is better. And in the next place, let's notice the Philistines champion. We have Goliath described for us, a guy we're all familiar with probably. And let's look at how the Bible text describes him. Beginning in verse 4, and a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, we don't really use that to measure height anymore. That's about 9 feet. He was over 9 feet tall, and 9 feet 9 inches, give or take to be exact. Now, that's an extremely tall human being. Right now, we've got Team USA playing basketball in the Olympics. I think the tallest guy we got out there is maybe 7'1", 7'2", something like that. So this guy's, this is a big guy. And there were big guys around back then. Goliath is certainly one of them. But he's their champion. Notice how he's described. Verse 5, he had a bronze helmet on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. That's 126 pounds. So can you imagine walking around with 126 pounds of armor? That's just your armor. That doesn't include your other accessories. That doesn't include anything else. Just 126 pounds of armor. So I think it's an understatement to say this man was strong. And notice verse 6, he had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. So he's got armor that really goes from his feet all the way to his knees to protect his legs. He's got a javelin between his shoulders, but that's not even his only weapon. We read in verse 7, now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels. That's about 15 pounds. So just the spearhead itself was 15 pounds. And a shield bearer went before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And you, the servants of Saul, choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. So really what he's saying is, hey guys, we can end this right here, right now. Right? You just send one of your men out to go against me. I'm the representative for the Philistines. You send out a representative for Israel. And whoever wins, wins the whole thing. Just one-on-one. Now, if there's a guy you don't want to go one-on-one against, this is the guy. Right? This is like showing up to the basketball court and LeBron James asks you to play one-on-one. You already know you're going to lose. For some of us older, Michael Jordan. If Michael Jordan came out and asked you to play one-on-one, you'd say no. You already know how that's going to go. So this is the man that comes out. This is their champion. This is their representative. Right? If you beat me, you get to win. If I beat you, I get to win. All these people don't have to die, just one or the other. Now, a lot of commentators say that his armor was really ineffective and really impractical if he's just a normal soldier. He's dressed especially for this. He's dressed for intimidation. They were going to see the sun shining off of his helmet. They were going to see the 126 pounds of chainmail that really in the Hebrew is scaled armor. He almost looks like a massive snake out there. And he's got these weapons with him, and he's taunting and yelling and screaming, trying to egg on the Israelites to send somebody to him. Now, he knows they're probably not going to send anybody out, right? This is all psychological warfare. He's trying to get into their head, right? If this is the one guy you see, what do you think about the guys behind me? What might they be like? So, and obviously it works. In verse 9, he continues, he says, if he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if you prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be your servants, and you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. Notice the response. This really does work. Look at Saul and Israel. Verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. They were terrified. Now I think, God, I've never been to war, but I imagine in every war there are some men who are scared. There has to be. But when the leader of all the men is scared, then you have a problem. And it says that Saul and all of Israel, they're terrified. So it works. So that's the Philistines' champion. Now we're going to be introduced to Israel's champion. And the contrast could not be any starker. Right, here we have this man, 9'9", walking around with 100 pounds of armor. He's got multiple weapons. He's got a shield bearer. He's boastful and loud, boisterous, crying out, challenging others. And now we get introduced to David. Now David, verse 12, was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons. And the man was old, advanced in years, in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. So notice the contrast here. David is the youngest son of an old man. His 3 older brothers are in battle, but he is not. And there's a lot of conjecture over why this is. The most popular theory is that David was not old enough to be counted among the men of war. And there was a law in Numbers chapter 1, verse number 3, we read about the men who are able to go to battle, and they have to be 20 years of age or older. So it's likely that David was younger than 20. He might have been 19, 18, 17, we don't know. But he's not among those men. So just think about the contrast. You've got David, who is running back and forth from the battlefield to tend his father's sheep. Young man. His father is kind of a nobody. And then you've got Goliath, the battle-hardened soldier who's taunting an entire army by himself. So the contrast there is meant to stick out in our minds. We see the lowly errand that David is on. Look at that, beginning in verse number 17. Then Jesse said to his son David, "Take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves. And run to your brothers at the camp. And carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them." So notice there, verse 19 too. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So notice, again, David's not really part of the battle, is he? He's kind of an errand boy. And even his dad says, hey, go take some provisions to the real men, right? Go see how your brothers are doing. Go to their captain. Give them some cheese and some bread to sustain themselves. So he's kind of the gopher instead of being actually in the battle. So again, the contrast between David and Goliath could not be any starker. Now notice, David catches wind of the talk of the camp. And of course, what do you think they're talking about? The only thing they can think about is Goliath. And when David shows up on the scene in verse 20, it says he rises up early in the morning, he left the sheep with the keeper, he took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him, and he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. So what that means is nobody has taken Goliath up on his challenge. And David left his supplies in the hands of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then, as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So he's continuing. He's got this script that he has. He has this monologue where he goes out there and he defies the armies of Israel. He challenges them. He taunts them. So David heard them, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. These are soldiers, and they were running away. They're so terrified. So the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel." What does that mean? So to speak, there's a bounty on Goliath's head, right? So Saul, nobody, and remember, these are soldiers. Nobody has the gumption to go against Goliath, so Saul has to sweeten the pot a little bit, right? He says, hey, your father's house, your family doesn't have to pay taxes. You get to marry my daughter, and in our culture we say, well, that's kind of weird, right? Offering off his daughter as part of the, right? But for the men of Israel, wow, I get to be married to the king's daughter. What does that make me potentially? What does that make my heir potentially, right? You get to be married to the king's daughter, and you get great riches. So there's a bounty on Goliath's head. And even then, you got to think, there's somebody in that army who's materialistic. There's somebody in that army who says, hey, it's worth the shot just to not to pay taxes, right? Nobody takes him up on the offer. Nobody. And then here you have this little shepherd boy. Young man. But he has to ask more questions. He begins inquiring, is this true? You know how rumors spread. We've all seen how rumors spread. And you guys ever played the telephone game? So, yeah, some of y'all have. Okay. You play the telephone game and you say something as simple as, this carpet is red, right? And then it goes all the way around the room, and then all of a sudden somebody's dead, or, it's like, wait, what? So maybe David's thinking, hey, this is what people are saying, but maybe there's really something else going on here. So he starts to inquire. He starts asking questions. Notice verse 26. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" This is really important. Notice how David brings God into this. Up to this point, nobody's really mentioned God. Right? The Philistine, Goliath, he never said, "Hey, I defy the armies of the living God." What did he say? He said, "I defy the armies of Israel." But when David hears that, he doesn't take that as a neutral statement. Right? David hears that and says, wait a second, if you are against Israel, you're really against God. If you can stand there and defy the armies of Israel, who is Israel? That's God's chosen people. If you can defy the armies of Israel, you're defying the armies of God. So David hears this. It's not a neutral statement. He sees Goliath as personally affronting God. Verse 27, the people answered him in this manner, saying, "So shall it be done for the man who kills him." So that rumor, if you will, is confirmed. Exemption from taxes, riches, you get to marry the king's daughter, all that, if you kill Goliath. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. Anybody here an older brother? Yeah, I am. Yeah. Your younger sibling ever get on your nerves? Yeah. You ever told them to stop talking? Once or twice? Yeah, absolutely. So Eliab hears David scurrying around the camp asking everybody the same question. And you can just see his eyes rolling back in his head. He's like, this little guy, okay. But notice, Eliab, the oldest brother, when he heard David speaking to the men, Eliab's anger was aroused against David. And he said, "Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness?" Right, he's like, "Don't you have something more important to do? Go take care of those couple sheep." He says, "I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." So he's saying, David, you don't really care. You just want to see something juicy. You just want to see what's going to happen. But notice David's response, verse 29. "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" Now, if you compare that verse in a couple of different translations, pretty much all of them are going to say something a little bit different. One commentator I read said the way he would translate it is essentially, isn't there something important going on? In other words, he's saying, isn't there something to look into? Isn't there something to hear more about? Why is it that everybody is content to hear and watch this Philistine mock God openly without doing anything about it? Even after Saul sweetens the pot and offers what he offers, still no man in this army is willing to stand up and do the right thing. Isn't there a cause? Isn't there something to hear? Notice verse 30. Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing, and these people answered him as the first ones did. So now it's been confirmed. Now David knows this will be what happens if you kill Goliath. Now we start to see David's faith and courage in action. Now that he knows that it's true, now that these things are offered, now that nobody else is taking up the offer to kill Goliath, we see David and Saul's interaction. Verse 31. Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Think about that. Everybody's scared. Everybody's afraid. And here's this one man who has the gumption to look more into these things and say, who is this guy to defy the living God? That got to the king pretty quick. Then David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." Keep in mind here, who is this guy? And who is he talking to? Right? This is David, the young shepherd guy. He's not in the army. He stayed home to tend his father's sheep while everybody else went out to fight. And he's giving a pep talk to the king. And we start to see why God is taking the kingdom away from Saul and giving it to David. We start to see the difference between David and Saul. Saul needs the pep talk. David's the one doing the pep talking. Let no man's heart be afraid, verse 32. This is the leadership they needed. Verse 33. And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." In other words, this guy has been fighting in battles before you were born. And you think, what, you're going to run out and kill him? Notice David's response. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised, that is not part of God's covenant, Philistine, will be like one of them, seeing he's defied the armies of the living God." David tells Saul, God has providentially been preparing me for this moment. Those bears weren't really bears, they were Goliath practice. Those lions weren't really lions, that was Goliath practice. And when I thought I was wasting time keeping sheep for my father, God was really preparing me for one of the biggest moments of my life. Doesn't God do that in our lives? When we think we're just, flying in a holding pattern, we think our life's not going anywhere. And it's what we learn in those situations that God uses to teach us the lessons we need to know later on. So David says, hey, I've had some practice. I might not be a man of war, but I've killed lions. I've killed bears. Moreover, verse 37, we see the faith of David in verse 37. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he might? No. He probably? No. He will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. That's faith. There was no wavering for David. There was no second guessing. He said, God saw me through the battles with the lion, the battles with the bear. I know he'll see me through the battle with this Philistine, especially this Philistine who mocks God. Notice Saul. Saul says to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Do you know what's interesting to me? That's the only time we see God's name come out of Saul's mouth this entire account. We don't see Saul praying. We don't see Saul telling his troops, hey, the Lord is with us. Remember the Lord. The Lord can do it. The battle belongs to the Lord. Let's go win this for the Lord. None of that. The only time Saul mentions the Lord is when he tells David to go and do what he should have done. And that's exactly what we see David do. We see David give the battle to the Lord, and we see him prevail. Notice here with me, beginning in verse... I skipped a section, didn't I? I did. Well, let's pick up in verse number 38. So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. What is he doing? He's making him look like Goliath, isn't he? Hey, these are the things Goliath has. These are the things I would wear. Why don't you wear them? David fastened the sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. Now, we often hear that it didn't fit him. That could be, but that's not what the text says. The text says, David says, I have not tested this. I don't know, and if anybody in here was an athlete or is an athlete, I remember when I used to play sports, maybe we would get a new uniform, or we'd get a new pair of pants, or we get even a new pair of socks, even a new pair of cleats. And you're going to your first game with this new pair of equipment, and you're thinking, I'm not going to play good tonight. I'm not used to this. I like my old socks. I like my old shoes. And that might sound crazy, but that's how it is. And David's thinking, wait a second, I know how to sling a sling with my cloak on. I've never done it with all this armor on before. So he says, hey, I haven't tested this. I don't want to wear it. But it's more than that. Saul wants David to wear what Saul would wear, but David isn't like Saul. Saul wants David to lead the way Saul would lead, but David isn't going to lead that way. Saul wants David to win the way Saul would win, but that's not how David's going to win. David's not going to win with his sword or with his armor. He's going to win because of his faith. Verse 40, then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. Think about that. Think about that contrast. Right? What is Goliath wearing? Head-to-toe armor, hundreds of pounds. What does he have? He has more than one weapon. He's armed to the nines. And David has 5 rocks that he picked out of the river, a sling and a pouch. Now, I would encourage you to go to YouTube and look up how these dudes throw these slings. Right? This is not like a slingshot that used to use rocks to hit your sister with, right? That's not what David is using. This is a full body exercise with your hand over your head, twirling it as hard as you can, and these rocks come flying out of these slings. I mean, you could literally kill somebody, right? So this isn't just a little dinky kid's toy. This is a weapon. It's just not the weapon that anybody else would use in this situation. But it was the weapon that he was used to. It's the weapon that God used providentially to prepare him with. Verse 41. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him. Yeah, he should. For he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. So the Philistine did not take lightly. For this Philistine, this is like what he does for a living. He's the champion of the army of the Philistines. And for you to send out this little boy to him, in his eyes, it's offensive. It's distasteful. He curses him by his gods. Verse 44, and the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." All right, now we get into our last section here. David said to the Philistine, notice his faith here, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled." Remember, for David, this was a religious thing. This wasn't just David versus Goliath. This was somebody who has mocked God versus God. And David saw himself simply as a tool in the hands of Almighty God. And he says, "God, you're going to use me now." And notice, who does David give the glory to? David says ahead of time, right? It's easy to give the glory to God after you win. Yeah, right? I'm sure there's somebody out there who hasn't thought about God all day and then has a lucky break and then thanks God, right? That's easy to do. But David says going into it, God is going to give me this victory. He has that strong of a faith. This day, verse 46, the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Again, not that all the earth may know that David is good with a sling, not that all the earth may know that David has some skills, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and he's alive, and he's powerful. Verse 47, then all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So David knew, when David rejected Saul's armor and Saul's weapons, David knew that this was an opportunity for God to shine, for God to show how he gets a victory. And the way he gets a victory is not the way the world gets a victory. And that's something that's certainly still true today. So it was, when the Philistine arose and came near and drew to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. One shot. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore, David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that the champion was dead, they fled. So now the roles are completely reversed, right? Who's afraid now? It's not the armies of Israel, it's the armies of the Philistines. And this is a perfect example of poetic justice, right? Goliath gets his head chopped off with his own sword. I know it seems gruesome to us, but that principle there really is a way that God operates. God promises throughout the scriptures, throughout the book of Psalms, throughout the book of Proverbs, that the wicked will fall by their own devices. That there are men who set traps for others but fall into them themselves. And it's so fitting that Goliath would have his own head removed with his own sword, the sword he trusted in so deeply, by a man who had no sword but trusted in the power of God. Verse 52, now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted, and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron, and the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Shaharaim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Those are cities of the Philistines. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. Notice how David's decisive action, because of his faith, because of his trust, that God would be with him, that the battle belongs to the Lord, that God wasn't going to allow this Philistine to mock him. Because of his courage, because of his faith, because of his action, it's not just David who gets a victory. Who gets a victory? All of Israel gets a victory. And now those men who were afraid and scared and shaking in their boots or sandals or whatever they were wearing, now they are chasing those same enemies that they were cowering from. That's the power of faith. That's the power of decisive leadership. That's the power of courage. Those things are contagious. And we see that in this account. Now, the series this year has been, if I'm not mistaken, this summer rather, is Ancient Message, Modern Application. So with the time we have left, I just want to look at some principles of application. We touched on some of these. This isn't exhaustive. These are just some of the ones that jumped out to me and that I think are worth mentioning. So when we consider the story of David and Goliath, the first thing we should take note of is that conviction is courageous while crowds are cowering. What's really the difference between David and the rest of the men of Israel? Now, there's a lot of differences on the surface, right? He's younger than them, maybe better looking than them. He has less experience than them. Why is it that they're afraid and he's not? He has something they lacked: faith, conviction. And it wasn't just, mental assent, like, yeah, this is something I believe. I checked the box. Yes, okay, Yahweh is God. Next one. He really meant it and felt it in his bones. And there were no questions in David's mind. So when there were no questions in David's mind, there was no hesitation in his actions. And when there was no hesitation in his actions, there was no fear to be had. He overcame that through his faith. And we should be reminded that if we want to have courage, we're going to have conviction. A lot of people are scared right now. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of reasons to be scared, right? But as people of God, we ought to have a level of conviction that gives us some courage. Because we know, whatever the headline is, we know who's on the throne. We know who really rules in heaven. We know who rules in the kingdoms of men. We know who the Lord of Lords and King of Kings really is. And that ought to set us apart, and not in an egotistical way, not in an elitist way, but just in a, hey, there's a difference between people with conviction and without conviction. And we see that with David and Israel, and we should see that. Hopefully we do see that with the church and the world. David had this conviction about God's ability and God's faithfulness, and that allowed him to sail over the sea of fear. It allowed him to be different. And here's the thing. His difference made a difference in the lives of other people. His conviction spread to others. His courage spread to others. His faith spread to others. So we should be praying. I know I'm praying for God to help us to have that same conviction and that same courage. To stand up for things, even when you're doing it alone. To stand up for things, even when you're in the minority. David's conviction allowed him to do that. In Revelation chapter 21, verse number 8, there's a list of sins describing those who have no part in paradise, but instead are cast into the lake of fire. And this verse is kind of famous because there's a song that talks about how liars go into this lake of fire. Maybe you've heard that song. If not, that's great, honestly. It's not a very good song. But it always stuck out to me when you read that list of sins. It's not the only one. The New Testament has lists of sins throughout it. But this list of sins in Revelation chapter 21, verse 8, it starts with the cowardly. With those who were unwilling to stand up for what they know was true and right. And one of the big problems, especially in the book of Revelation, a lot of it is all about compromise. People, Christians, compromising about who really is the Lord. Christians compromising about, well, how should we or not worship God? People compromising about living for Christ in an age of wickedness. And when we read that, we shouldn't be afraid. When we read that, we should be emboldened to say, God, make me not like one of those cowards. Help me to have the conviction of David, even if I do it alone. Another important lesson we learn from this account is that God's past deliverances are proof of his future faithfulness. Personally, one of my favorite things David says in this whole account is right there in verse number 37 of 1 Samuel 17, where with this confidence, with this conviction, with this faith, he says, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. What was David doing? You know, David's faith wasn't a blind faith. He had proof, he had evidence. He had a historical record of God's faithfulness in the past that allowed him to believe in God's faithfulness in the future. And I want to encourage you, when you're going through a difficult time or when you have something difficult on the horizon, check out the rearview mirror and see what God has done for you in the past. And then ask yourself, if God was willing and able to do that then, why isn't he willing and able to do this now? David was confident, not just blindly, but because God had a proven track record. Now, what about us for Christians? I think we have an even added benefit that David didn't have. Because not only do we have our own personal record, our own personal lives, where we can look back on, and we can look, I've got a friend who likes to say, you've survived 100% of the things you thought you never would. Where we can look back and see what God has gotten us through, and that ought to give us confidence. But more than that, we can look through the entire record of the Scriptures. We can have confidence. The same God that parted the Red Sea is the God that has made promises to me. The same God that rose his Son from the dead is the same God that's with us today. The same God that saw Israel through those 40 years in the wilderness is the same God that's with us today. So we've got that record. We ought to be confident about what God has said about the future because of what he's done in the past. You know, if you've applied for a job recently or ever, you know, they like to see work history on your resume. Where have you been? What have you done? What are some references that I can call and make sure you're not making it all up, right? Can you imagine if God gave you his resume? Can you imagine the work history in that resume? Well, I mean, we kind of have it right here, don't we? And so if we're doubting who's in charge, we should take a look at his resume and see some of the other work he's done. And say, wow, you know what? God really knows what he's doing. God really is able, and he really can see us through whatever the difficulty it is that we're going through. In the next place, I want us to pay attention to the fact that faith really is the victory. I know we sing that. I know we say that. But if there's anywhere that just puts it on display, it's right here in the life of David. And you might read about that and say, well, I can't have that kind of faith. I can't be that confident. I can't be that convicted. You can. I promise you, you can. It might take changing some things in your life, changing some habits, changing some ways of thinking, changing some outlooks, changing some perspectives, but it is possible. David isn't superhuman. He's a human just like you and me. He's just like us, flesh and blood. We can have that same conviction, that same confidence, that same faith. And the Bible tells us that there's nobody who overcomes the world except for this one, the one who's been born of the Son of God. Faith is the victory that overcomes the world. We read that in 1 John chapter 5, and it is true. And we see it, hopefully not only in our own lives, but also especially in the life of David. That faith really is the victory. And if we're going to be different from the world around us, just like David being different from all the rest of those Israelites, if we're going to experience the blessings of God, the victories of God, it will be by faith. There's really no other way. God help us have a faith, a strong faith, just like David. The next place we should keep in mind and take home that your giants are not giant to God. That's a lesson that isn't original to me. That's something that a lot of people have said about this account of David and Goliath. And you know, faith allows you to see things differently from other people. And when Israel looked at Goliath, they saw a 9'9", huge, gigantic dude with a bunch of armor and weapons. And when David looked at Goliath, he saw a fallen enemy of God. Because he knew that as big as Goliath was, he was not something that God could not handle. And the story of David and Goliath is not about what people make it about. It's not about the Giants versus the Patriots. It's not about Alabama versus whatever Division III school they play in Week 8, right? That's not what David and Goliath is about. David and Goliath is about something much bigger. It's about what God can do when we give the battle over to him. And if we go in with faith, and if we depend on him, and if we seek him, and acknowledge that it's him who's going to get this victory, not us, then he can make all the difference. This is a personal note. I know we're running out of time, but because of some some experiences and trauma in my childhood, I'll call myself a recovering claustrophobic. Small spaces in me don't really agree. And it's not just because of my size. I'm not a big Universal or Disney World fan for that reason, right? But I had to go to mental health counseling just to get on an elevator. Elevators were like the bane of my existence. I was terrified of them. And I was fortunate enough to go through some faith-based counseling. And one of the questions my counselor asked me, and it sounds like a silly question, but it really changed my life. He said, "Do you think God is scared of elevators?" Now you think that's kind of a silly question. That obviously the answer is no. Why would God be scared of an elevator? And then he got me to think about that same God who's not scared of elevators, you believe is with you everywhere you go. That same God who's not scared of elevators will be with you in that elevator just a prayer away. And it might seem simple, it might seem dumb to some of you, I don't know. But for me, it made all the difference in the world because it made me realize that my giant was not a giant to God, even something that small. Now for David, he knew that Goliath was big to him, but Goliath wasn't big to God. Is that like, I'm done? Is that what that built? Oh, great. That's awesome. That's awesome. Okay, cool. We're about to skip some stuff, but now we're okay. Another point I want you to take home tonight is that God's arsenal is always otherworldly. If you were to peek behind the curtain of God's armory, if you were to look into his storage shed where he keeps his weapons, you would not see the weapons of the world. You would see something completely different. And we see that put into such a clear image in this account, where Goliath runs in with his javelin and with his sword and with his armor, and David runs in with his sling and with his stones. God is going to accomplish his will, not using what the world would use to accomplish it. And the New Testament takes this principle and applies it all over the place, especially to Jesus. Right? If man were to save the world, they wouldn't do it by dying on a cross. But what does God choose? To shame the wise and to silence the boastful. He chooses the bloody cross of Christ to be his instrument of salvation. God always does that. He chooses the unexpected. He chooses the base. He chooses the humble. He chooses what you wouldn't choose so that you can know that he's God and you're not. And he's going to do that in our lives as well, in the battle that we're in as Christians, this spiritual battle. The Bible tells us in 2 Corinthians 10, verses 3 through 5, though we walk in the flesh, we do not wage war according to the flesh. Right? Our weapons are not carnal, but they are mighty in spiritual, divine power to bring down those strongholds, to bring every thought captive to Christ. We don't wage war the way the world wages war. David didn't, at least not here, and we certainly shouldn't as well. The world's devices, the world's tools, they're not God's devices and tools. So if you're on God's side and the victory looks unlikely, that's exactly how God wants it to be. That's exactly how God wants it to look. It should look almost impossible. That's when you know that God is acting. That's when you know that God is leading. Our last one, I think, and this will lead us into our invitation and encouragement tonight. I want to encourage you to rally behind the champion who slew your enemies. If you read books that mention David and Goliath and try to apply David and Goliath, there's always this debate over where's our part in this story? Where's our part in this account? And I touched on some of this. A lot of people say, we're David, and God is empowering us to slay our giants. And I don't think that's a bad application. That certainly is there. That's a part of what's going on there. When we give that victory to God, when we give that battle to God, he will come through, and we ought to have that faith and that trust. But there's something much deeper going on here. Remember I said earlier, whenever you see King David acting heroically, you should start thinking about Jesus. He's the son of David. He sits on David's throne. It's he, Jesus, who's the fulfillment of God's promise to David in 2 Samuel 7 to always have a son, an heir, on the throne. I want you to see David, not just as yourself, I want you to see David as Jesus Christ. And who are we? Brethren, if we're honest, we are the Israelites cowering behind him, who know that we don't have what it takes to defeat our enemy. And it's Jesus who stands up and says, you don't have to defeat the enemy because I will defeat him for you. And it's Jesus who takes these, we would say, unlikely tools of humility, tools of emptying himself, tools of the cross, and uses those things to destroy our worst enemies. What did Jesus do for us? Jesus took out the enemy of death. Jesus took out the enemy of sin. Jesus took out and is taking out and will take out the enemy of Satan. The Bible tells us this is why he appeared into the world, to destroy the works of the devil. The Bible tells us that it's by death that Jesus destroyed death. Hebrews 2, that he tasted death for everyone, that he might destroy the one who has power over death, the devil, so that we would no longer be subject to that fear. Brothers, sisters, friends, neighbors, I want us to think about this fact, that up until Jesus' death on the cross, one of Satan's biggest weapons in his arsenal was death. And just like David took Goliath's sword from him to cut off his own head, Jesus took Satan's weapon and used that to destroy him. Jesus, through his death on the cross, the very thing that Satan wanted to happen, Jesus, through his death on the cross, made it so that we don't have to fight that enemy by ourselves. Made it so that us, by placing our faith, our trust, our hope in him, we can have that victory that he won on our behalf. And just like the Israelites, who went from cowering in fear to rising up in courage and chasing their enemies, Jesus can do the same for us. And when we look down the pike, and when we see death, when we see the devil, when we see even the mountain of our own personal sin at the feet of a holy God, we can know that we don't have to fight that battle ourselves, that Jesus not only fights it for us, but that Jesus won it for us. So my encouragement this evening is that we can let the victory belong to God. We can tap into his otherworldly arsenal. We can have the faith that brings the conviction we need to live for God in the modern world. We can rally behind our champion, Jesus Christ. My encouragement for you this evening is not to cower in your camp. Don't wonder whether or not God is for us as Christians. Don't worry about what will happen if you have to fight your enemies with your own strength. Jesus Christ has and will fight for you. Our job is simply to lift his banner, to rally behind his charge, to follow his lead, to let his victory be our own. And we can do that by placing our resolute faith and trust in him. And just like David overcame Goliath, because of Jesus' victory, you can overcome death, sin, and Satan, not just tonight, but every night. If you follow him, if you commit to him, if you follow his charge. I know there might be some here tonight who have not done that. And if you want to have the victory that only Jesus can give you over your worst enemies, sin, Satan, and death, I hope that you'll make that choice tonight, to be like those Israelites charging after David, receiving the victory that he won for them. Won't you come and take the victory that Jesus Christ got for you while we stand and sing this song?